In the spring of 1994, a Kurdish shepherd was walking across a barren limestone hilltop in southeastern Turkey when he noticed something in the soil. He had probably walked past it dozens of times before, but on this particular day, something caught his eye. A curved shape protruding from the ground. Not rock, not root, something carved. He reported what he found to the nearby museum at Sanliurfa. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to look. Schmidt had been searching for prehistoric sites in the region for years. He had seen a lot of stone. He knew immediately that what the shepherd had found was different. He spent the rest of his life excavating it. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means Potbelly Hill. It is an unremarkable name for one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of archaeology. What Schmidt found under that limestone hilltop was a complex of circular stone enclosures, each one containing massive T-shaped pillars arranged in precise patterns. The pillars are made from local limestone carved from the bedrock, shaped with stone tools, transported to the site and raised upright. The largest of them stand nearly 6 meters tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons, and they are covered in carvings: foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, aurochs, cranes, ducks, wild boar. Animals rendered with skill and attention to detail that would be impressive in any era. On some of the pillars, human arms are carved in relief with hands visible at the ends. The pillars are not just structural elements, they are figures. Stylized human forms, massive and silent, arranged in circles and facing each other across the spaces between them. The radiocarbon dates came back from the laboratory. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe were built approximately 11,500 years ago. Some researchers push the date back further still. The construction began, by the most conservative estimates, around 9,600 years before the birth of Christ. To put that in context, the Egyptian pyramids are approximately 4,500 years old. The oldest cities in Mesopotamia are approximately 6,000 years old. The agricultural revolution, the moment humanity first began to deliberately plant crops and domesticate animals, began approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe was built at the very beginning of that transition, or possibly before it. The people who built it were, by every piece of evidence available at the site, hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no permanent settlements as far as anyone can establish, no pottery, no metal tools, no writing. And they built one of the most extraordinary structures in human history. The conventional model of how civilization develops says this should not be possible. The conventional model says that monumental architecture requires surplus food, which requires agriculture, which requires permanent settlement, which requires social complexity that takes generations to develop. The story is supposed to go in one direction: food surplus first, then everything else. Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence, or challenges it so fundamentally that the sequence itself has to be rethought. But Göbekli Tepe is not the only problem. It is the most spectacular and the most thoroughly documented. But when you start looking at the full picture of what existed before Egypt, before the first pharaoh, before the moment in history when civilization as we conventionally understand it appears, the picture is far stranger and far more interesting than the textbooks suggest. Because something was here before, something more organized, more sophisticated, more ambitious than the standard narrative allows for. The traces of it are everywhere, in the genetic record, in the astronomical alignments of structures built by people who should not have had that knowledge, in the sudden appearance of Egyptian civilization in what seems like an impossibly advanced form, with almost no visible developmental stages, in the specific content of the oldest Egyptian religious texts, which speak of a time before the current age, a first time, a period when the gods walked the earth and established the foundations of everything that came after. We do not fully understand what existed before Egypt. That is the truth, the honest truth. But what we do know is extraordinary, and it suggests that the story of human civilization is considerably older and considerably stranger than most people are taught to believe. Let us start with what we know for certain. Let us start with Egypt itself, with the moment the pharaohs appear, and with what makes that moment so deeply strange when you look at it carefully. The conventional history of ancient Egypt begins with a man we call Narmer. He ruled approximately 3,100 years before the birth of Christ. He is famous primarily because of an object found at the site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt in 1898, the Narmer palette, a ceremonial carved schist palette approximately 63 centimeters tall, decorated on both sides with relief carvings that document apparently the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. The Narmer palette is a remarkable object for many reasons. It is exquisite carved. The artistic conventions it uses, the specific way of depicting the human figure, the hieratic scale that shows important figures larger than less important ones, the symbolic vocabulary of crowns and standards and postures of dominance and submission, all of these are fully developed. They are not primitive, they are not experimental, they are sophisticated and standardized. This is the problem. From the very first moment Egyptian civilization appears in the archaeological record, it appears fully formed. The writing system that accompanies the Narmer palette is not simple. It is not the earliest stage of a system that gradually develops over centuries. It is complex, capable of recording proper names and titles and abstract concepts. The artistic conventions are not rough early attempts at representation. They are precise and controlled. The social hierarchy implied by the objects is not embryonic. It is elaborate, with a king at the top, a bureaucracy below him, religious institutions and a military. Where did it come from? How does a civilization this complex appear this suddenly? The conventional answer is that we are missing the intermediate stages, that the evidence for the gradual development of Egyptian civilization is out there in the desert, but has not been fully excavated or has been eroded away. And this is partly true. There is a predynastic period, a long span of time before Narmer, during which Egyptian culture was developing. We know about it. But the predynastic period, when you examine it closely, raises as many questions as it answers. The predynastic period of Egypt is roughly divided by archaeologists into a series of cultural phases, named after the sites where their characteristic remains were first identified. The earliest phase is the Badarian, named for the site of Badari in Upper Egypt. The Badarian culture dates to approximately 5000 to 4000 BC. These people made extraordinarily fine pottery, among the most technically accomplished pottery produced in the ancient world. The walls of the best Badarian vessels are so thin and so even that they have been compared to eggshells. Achieving this level of craftsmanship requires not just skill, but a tradition of skill, accumulated and refined over many generations. The Badarian people also used copper, not in large quantities, but it was there. They traded over significant distances, with material from the Red Sea coast appearing at inland sites, and material from the Nile Valley appearing at coastal sites. They buried their dead with grave goods that suggest beliefs about what happens after death, specific beliefs detailed enough to require specific material provisions. This is not primitive culture. This is sophisticated culture. But it is also not the same as what comes later. The Badarian pottery, magnificent as it is not the same as the pottery of the Naqada cultures that follow it. The burial practices are not the same. The social organization implied by the sites is not the same. There is development, continuity of a kind, but it is not the smooth and inevitable progression toward the pharaonic state that the conventional narrative implies. The Naqada culture, which succeeds the Badarian, is named for a site in Upper Egypt and is itself divided into 3 phases spanning roughly 4000 to 3100 BC. By the end of the Naqada sequence, by approximately Naqada 3, the evidence for social hierarchy, long-distance trade, specialized craft production, and incipient writing is abundant. The pieces of the pharaonic state are assembling. The predynastic kings, the figures we call Scorpion I and Scorpion II and Ka and Erihor, are visible in fragmentary form in the material record, and then Narmer, and then Egypt. But something happens in the century or two before Narmer that no one has fully explained. The pace of change accelerates dramatically. The changes that had been occurring over millennia in the pre-dynastic sequence begin happening within generations. The writing system appears to develop, or is adopted, or is elaborated with startling speed. The monumental architecture expands in scale. The royal tombs at Abydos, the burial site of the earliest dynastic kings, are large and complex structures requiring the coordination of substantial labour. The material culture shifts in ways that suggest contact with, or influence from Mesopotamia, from the urban cultures developing simultaneously in what is now Iraq and Iran. The specific nature of this contact is one of the most debated questions in early Egyptian archaeology. There are objects in the Naqada 2 and 3 layers that are clearly not Egyptian in origin or style. Cylinder seals, a Mesopotamian technology. Artistic motifs, including the specific image of a hero flanked by 2 animals that appears in Mesopotamian art from the same period. Long-necked animals with intertwined necks decorating ceremonial palettes that are unique to this brief, transitional period and then disappear from Egyptian art entirely. What does it mean? Did a group of people from Mesopotamia arrive in Egypt during this critical period and catalyze the development of the pharaonic state? Did Egyptian traders visiting Mesopotamia bring back ideas and technologies that accelerated local development? Was there a more complex web of exchange and influence connecting the 2 civilizations at the moment of their emergence? Nobody knows. And that uncertainty is important to hold on to as we go further, because it reminds us that the origins of Egyptian civilization are not as clear and as settled as most popular accounts suggest. The story is not told, the evidence is fragmentary, the questions are real. Now let us go back further, much further, before the Badarian, before the earliest traces of what will eventually become pharaonic Egypt. Let us go to the place where the story of pre-Egyptian civilization gets genuinely strange. Let us go to the Sahara. The Sahara today is the largest hot desert in the world. Approximately 9 million square kilometers of sand and gravel and rock, almost entirely devoid of the kind of vegetation and water that would support significant human populations. It is not a place where you would look for evidence of a sophisticated prehistoric civilization, And yet that is exactly what researchers have found there. The African humid period, which we have discussed in the context of other videos on this channel, transformed the Sahara between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years ago. During this period, driven by the same astronomical cycles that drive the ice ages, the monsoon rains extended northward across what is now desert, feeding rivers and lakes and supporting grasslands and open woodland across a vast area of North Africa. The Sahara was not the Sahara. It was a mosaic of savanna and wetland and forest, teeming with the large animals visible in the rock art that covers the cliff faces and cave walls of regions that today receive almost no rainfall. In this green Sahara, people lived. They herded cattle, they fished the lakes that fill the desert basins, they painted and carved images of their world onto the rock with extraordinary skill and energy. And in one specific location, in the eastern Sahara in what is now the Nubian Desert of southern Egypt, approximately 100 kilometers west of the town of Abu Simbel, they did something that no one expected to find. They built an astronomical observatory. The site is called Nabta Playa. It was identified in the 1970s by a team of researchers including the archaeologist Fred Wendorf, and was dated by subsequent investigation to approximately 7,000 to 5,000 BC. In other words, 2,000 years before the earliest Egyptian dynasty, 5,000 years before the Great Pyramid. At Nabta Playa there are stone megaliths, large upright stones arranged in specific patterns across the ancient lake bed. There are cattle burials in complex stone-lined chambers, and there is a stone circle, sometimes called Africa's Stonehenge, constructed from upright slabs that appear to have been aligned to specific astronomical events. The alignment that researchers have focused on most extensively is an orientation to the summer solstice sunrise. The stones of the circle at Nabta Playa were arranged so that a specific alignment indicated the point on the horizon where the sun rose at the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. This is the same basic astronomical event that Stonehenge is oriented to, though Stonehenge is 2,000 years younger than Nabta Playa. The summer solstice matters enormously to pastoral people in the Sahara, because it marks a specific point in the seasonal cycle with critical implications for rainfall. The monsoon rains that made the Green Sahara possible followed a predictable seasonal pattern, and people who depended on those rains for their cattle and their crops needed to know precisely when they would arrive. An astronomical marker for the solstice would have been practically valuable. But the astronomy at Nabta Playa is not limited to the solstice alignment of the stone circle. Astronomical researcher Thomas Brophy, analysing the site in the early 2000s, proposed that specific upright stones within the circle were arranged to align with particular stars in specific configurations, including several stars in the constellation Orion, at specific dates between 6,000 and 4,500 BC. If his analysis is correct, the people of Nabta Playa had a sophisticated understanding of stellar positions and their relationship to the seasonal cycle, going back to a period that the conventional historical narrative regards as essentially prehistoric. The significance of the Orion connection is not just the astronomy itself, it is what the astronomy might connect to. Because Orion, the constellation, is at the centre of one of the most famous and most debated theories about ancient Egyptian monuments, the alignment of the three Giza pyramids to the three belt stars of Orion, proposed by Robert Bauval in 1994, suggests a continuity of astronomical tradition stretching from the pastoral people of the Green Sahara to the builders of the most famous monuments in human history. The same constellation, the same orientation, 2,000 years apart. We do not know if this connection is real. We do not know if the people of Nabta Playa were the ancestors, cultural or biological, of the people who eventually built the pyramids. The evidence for a direct connection is suggestive but not definitive. But the existence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge in the Sahara at such an early date, combined with the physical evidence of organized ritual activity at the site, raises a question that is uncomfortable for the conventional narrative. What if the astronomical and religious traditions of dynastic Egypt did not originate in the Nile Valley? What if they were brought to the Nile Valley by people who had developed those traditions during the long millennia when the Sahara was green and habitable, and who moved to the Nile Valley as the green Sahara dried out and became uninhabitable between approximately 5000 and 3000 BC? The timing of this desiccation, the drying of the Sahara, corresponds with a dramatic increase in population in the Nile Valley during the Naqada period. The first Egyptian settlements in the Nile Valley show a marked increase in cultural complexity and population density at approximately the same time that the Saharan population was being displaced by the advancing desert. People moved. They moved east toward the only reliable water source in the region, the Nile, and they brought with them everything they knew. If this is correct, the roots of Egyptian civilization extend not just back through the predynastic period in the Nile Valley, but out across the Sahara, into the millennia when the desert was a world of lakes and cattle and astronomical monuments built by people whose names we do not know. There is something else at Nabta Playa that deserves more attention than it usually receives: the cattle burials. At Nabta Playa, excavations have revealed a series of elaborate subterranean chambers, each containing the complete skeleton of a cow or bull, arranged in specific positions and covered with a capstone of sandstone. The chambers are not random. They are organized in specific patterns relative to each other and to the stone. Megaliths on the surface. They clearly represent ritual activity of considerable sophistication, activity that implies not just belief, but organized belief, a shared religious framework that determined what should be buried, how it should be arranged, and where it should be placed in relation to other burials and to the standing stones. The cattle cult of Nabta Playa connects directly to one of the most important and most puzzling features of ancient Egyptian religion. The cow goddess Hathor, one of the most ancient deities in the Egyptian pantheon, is associated with the sky, with motherhood, with fertility, with music, and with the sun. Her symbol is the sun disk between cow horns. She is sometimes identified with the night sky itself, her body the great arc of the Milky Way. And she is among the oldest divine figures in Egyptian religious tradition, predating the more famous deities of the classical Egyptian pantheon. If the people who performed the cattle rituals at Nabta Playa were the ancestors of the people who eventually worshipped Hathor in dynastic Egypt, then the origins of Egyptian religion are not in the Nile Valley. They are in the Sahara, in the pastoral culture of the green desert, in the ceremonies performed around standing stones and cattle burials at a site that the monsoon rains eventually abandoned, leaving only the stones and the bones and the question of who was here and what they knew. The connection cannot be proven, but it can be suggested, and the suggestion fits the evidence better than the alternative, which is to treat Nabta Playa and dynastic Egypt as unrelated phenomena that happen to develop similar religious themes by coincidence. Now let's talk about the city that time almost forgot, Hierakonpolis, known in ancient Egyptian as Nekhen, sits on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, about 100 kilometers south of Luxor. It is not famous in the way that Giza or Luxor or Karnak are famous. Most tourists do not visit it. Most people who are not specialists in ancient Egyptian archaeology have never heard of it. But Hierakonpolis may be the oldest city in Egypt. It may be the oldest city in Africa. And what has been found there in the last 4 decades of excavation has quietly transformed our understanding of how Egyptian civilization emerged. The site was first excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the initial work produced important finds, including the Nama palette. But the more systematic excavations that began in the 1970s and have continued to the present revealed something that the early excavators did not anticipate. Hierakonpolis was not just a predynastic site in the sense of having some early material beneath the later layers. It was a substantial urban settlement dating back to approximately 3800 BC, perhaps earlier, with evidence of complex social organization, specialized craft production, ceremonial activity, and a population dense enough to generate the kind of food production pressure that normally drives rapid cultural development. The evidence for this early complexity at Hierakonpolis is extraordinary. There is the brewery. The oldest evidence for large-scale beer production ever found anywhere in the world comes from Hierakonpolis, dating to approximately 3500 BC. This is not a domestic-scale operation. It is an industrial facility capable of producing hundreds of litres of beer at a time. Beer production at this scale implies organised agriculture, management of grain stores, coordinated labour, and distribution of the product to a population that expected it. It implies, in other words, the institutional structures of a proto-state. There is the ceremonial precinct. Hierakonpolis contains what appears to be a large formal space used for ritual activities, with material evidence including painted plaster walls, unusual deposits of exotic animals including elephants and baboons and hippopotamuses, and objects that are clearly ceremonial rather than functional. This precinct predates the formal temples of dynastic Egypt but clearly prefigures them. The pattern of ritual space, restricted access, special deposits is the same. There is the cemetery. The predynastic cemetery at Hierakonpolis contains tombs of varying sizes and elaboration that clearly reflect a stratified society. The largest and most elaborate tombs, with painted walls and multiple chambers, belong to individuals who commanded enough social power to mobilize the labor required to build them and the wealth to fill them with valuable objects. This is not an egalitarian society. This is a society with elites, with people who controlled resources and accumulated power, with a social hierarchy that is the necessary precondition for the pharaonic state. And yet Hierakonpolis is not Nama's Egypt. It is earlier, it is cruder in some respects, and more mysterious in others. The painted tomb walls at Hierakonpolis show scenes of boats, of figures in combat, of animals, using a visual language that has some features in common with later Egyptian art, but also features that are not found in dynastic Egyptian art at all. The boats are particularly striking. They are large, with multiple oarsmen, and they appear to be engaged in some kind of ritual or ceremonial activity. Boats, in both the pre-dynastic material record and in dynastic Egyptian religion, carry enormous symbolic weight. The solar bark, the boat that carries the sun god through the underworld every night, is one of the most persistent and powerful images in the entire corpus of Egyptian religious thought. The boats at Hierakonpolis may represent the earliest visual expression of this mythology. What Hierakonpolis tells us is that the Egyptian state did not emerge from a pastoral or village context directly into the complexity of the Nama period. There was an intermediate phase, a phase of proto-urban complexity, lasting perhaps 1,000 years, in which the specific institutions and belief systems and social structures that would eventually crystallize into the pharaonic state were being developed and tested and refined. Hierakonpolis was a crucible, a place where the Egyptian experiment in complex society was being worked out before it achieved its final form. If you are settling in for the night, this is exactly the kind of story these videos are made for. Please consider subscribing and leaving a like if you have not already. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. The geography of who listens to these is one of my favourite things about making them. And let us keep going, because we have not yet reached the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is not in Egypt. It is in Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe. We started there, but we need to come back. Because Göbekli Tepe is not just a remarkable sight, it is a fundamentally disruptive one. It disrupts the story not just of Egyptian origins, but of human civilization as a whole. And to understand what it disrupts, you need to understand what the conventional model actually requires. The conventional model of the development of civilization is called the Neolithic Revolution hypothesis, and it was formulated by the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe in the 1930s. The basic argument is this: hunter-gatherers, by definition, move with their food supply. They cannot invest in permanent architecture because they cannot stay in one place long enough to maintain it. They cannot develop complex social hierarchies because the mobility required by their lifestyle prevents the accumulation and inheritance of property that drives hierarchy. They cannot develop writing because writing serves the needs of an administrative system, managing stored surpluses and complex economic relationships, and hunter-gatherers have no stored surpluses and simple economic relationships. Agriculture changes everything. When people begin to produce food rather than forage for it, they can stay in one place. Staying in one place allows investment in permanent architecture. Stored agricultural surplus enables the emergence of specialists who do not grow their own food, but exchange their services for food grown by others. Among those specialists are administrators, priests, warriors, craftspeople. The social hierarchy that results from the unequal control of stored food surplus is the foundation on which all subsequent civilization is built. This is not a wrong model. As a description of what happened in many places at many times, it is broadly accurate. The correlation between the development of agriculture and the subsequent development of complex societies is real and robust. But Göbekli Tepe breaks the model, or at least severely complicates it. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. The evidence is unambiguous on this point. The faunal remains at the site, the bones left over from meals are dominated by wild animals, gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, wild ass. There are no domesticated animals in the earliest layers. The botanical remains tell a similar story. The plant foods found at the site are wild plants, not cultivated ones. And yet these hunter-gatherers built something that required, by any reasonable estimate, an enormous amount of coordinated labour. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe weigh between 10 and 20 tons. The limestone quarry from which they were extracted is visible nearby, and unfinished pillars still visible there confirm that the extraction was done with stone tools, without metal. Moving a 20-ton stone block with stone tools and human muscle and wooden levers and ropes requires not just many people, but many organized people. People who know who is supposed to do what and in what sequence. People who have the social structure to sustain coordination over the extended time a project like this requires. Klaus Schmidt, who spent more time at Göbekli Tepe than anyone else, estimated that the site might have required the labour of several hundred people working periodically over extended periods. Those people had to eat. Someone had to organise their feeding. Someone had to organise the work itself. Someone had to determine what the enclosures should look like, which animals should be carved on which pillars, where each pillar should be placed. This is social complexity. Real social complexity. Not the elaborate kind that comes with writing and cities and bureaucracies, but the kind that requires persistent social organisation beyond the small family groups that form the basic unit of most hunter-gatherer societies. The kind that requires, in anthropological terms, a society organised above the band level. How did hunter-gatherers achieve this? The most interesting answer that has been proposed is that they achieved it through the very act of building Göbekli Tepe. That the monument was not the product of surplus-driven social complexity, but the cause of it. That the gathering of people for ritual purposes, the shared project of constructing something magnificent, was itself the mechanism by which social bonds were formed and social hierarchies were established and sustained. If this is correct, it inverts the Neolithic revolution hypothesis in the most fundamental possible way. Agriculture did not create the social complexity that eventually built monuments. The creation of monuments, the shared ritual project, created the social complexity that eventually created agriculture. Schmidt found compelling evidence for this in the geography of the site itself. Göbekli Tepe sits on a barren hilltop. There is no water on the hilltop. There are no good agricultural soils. There is no strategic defensive advantage. There is no economic reason for the site to be where it is. The only reason to build there is symbolic. The view from the hilltop is extensive, taking in a vast sweep of the landscape that would eventually become the most important region in the development of agriculture. The location was chosen for its visibility, its prominence, its suitability as a place set apart from ordinary life, for purposes that were not ordinary. And within sight of Göbekli Tepe, on the lower slopes and in the surrounding valleys, are some of the earliest known examples of wild grain cultivation. The first tentative steps toward agriculture happen in the shadow of the monument. The people who began deliberately cultivating wild incorn wheat in the foothills around Göbekli Tepe were probably the same people, or the immediate descendants of the people who were gathering periodically at the hilltop enclosures for ritual purposes. The monument and the agriculture were part of the same cultural process, not sequential stages with one causing the other, but intertwined expressions of a society in transition. Let us stop and think about what this means for the story of before Egypt. If the creation of monuments preceded and possibly drove the development of agriculture rather than following from it, then the sequence by which civilization develops is more flexible than the Neolithic revolution hypothesis suggests. The human impulse to build things that go beyond immediate practical necessity, to create spaces and objects that express and reinforce shared beliefs and shared identity, is not a late luxury that only emerges after the basics of food production have been mastered. It is one of the earliest and most powerful forces in human cultural development, and if that is true, then the gap between Göbekli Tepe and the first pharaohs is not a gap between two different kinds of societies. It is a continuous thread. The ritual impulse that drove the construction of Göbekli Tepe is the same impulse that built the ceremonial precinct at Hierakonpolis. The astronomical knowledge encoded at Nabta Playa is the same kind of knowledge expressed in the orientation of Egyptian temples to solar and stellar events. The cattle rituals of the Saharan pastoralists are the precursors of the cattle goddess Hathor. The civilization that built the pyramids did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a long tradition of ritual complexity, astronomical observation, and organized social activity that stretches back not just to the predynastic period in the Nile Valley, but much further, across the Green Sahara and into the early Holocene, into the very first centuries after the Younger Dryas ended and the world warmed and human populations began, slowly and tentatively, to experiment with new ways of living. Egypt was not the beginning. It was the culmination, the most spectacular and the most durable expression of a tradition that had been building for thousands of years before the first pharaoh put on the double crown. But even knowing this, even tracing the thread back as far as we can, there is still something that does not quite fit. Something about Egypt specifically that resists explanation by gradual development, no matter how far back you push the beginning. The problem is the writing. Egyptian hieroglyphics are one of the most complex writing systems ever developed. They are also one of the oldest. The earliest examples of hieroglyphic writing date to approximately 3200 BC, in the period immediately before the unification of Egypt under Narmer, and those earliest examples are not simple or primitive. They are hieroglyphics, fully formed, capable of recording proper names and titles and complex ideas. Every other writing system in history for which we have a reasonably complete developmental record shows a clear trajectory from simple to complex. Sumerian cuneiform began as simple, pictographic marks on clay tablets recording economic transactions. Over centuries, the pictographs became more abstract. The system became more capable of recording complex speech, and what began as a counting system evolved into a full writing system. The developmental sequence is visible in the material record. For Egyptian hieroglyphics, the developmental sequence is not visible. The earliest hieroglyphics we have are already sophisticated. The system is already capable of doing things that require considerable complexity, recording phonetic information, representing grammatical relationships, encoding information about proper names. Where did this come from? The most cautious answer is that we simply have not found the earlier, simpler stages. The evidence has not survived or has not been excavated. This is possible. Egypt is a large country, and its prehistoric remains are incompletely investigated. But the absence of early stages for the Egyptian writing system in a region where archaeological investigation has been relatively intensive for over a century is at least notable. A more adventurous answer, proposed by various researchers over the years, is that Egyptian writing did not develop gradually from simple precursors within Egypt. It was inspired by, or possibly adapted from, a contact with Mesopotamia during the critical period of the late Naqada phase. The Mesopotamian writing system was developing at exactly the same time, also from relatively simple beginnings. If Egyptian elites had contact with Mesopotamia during this period, which the archaeological evidence suggests they did, it is possible that the idea of writing, if not the specific system, was adopted and then rapidly developed into a distinctively Egyptian form. But this explanation, while plausible, does not fully account for the speed. The adoption of an idea and its development into a complex system capable of recording sophisticated linguistic information does not normally happen in a generation or two. Writing systems are conventionally understood to take centuries to develop. Unless there was already a body of symbolic knowledge, a pre-literate tradition of encoding information in visible marks, that could be rapidly elaborated into a full writing system when the right catalysts appeared. Unless the astronomical markers at Nabta Playa and the symbolic vocabulary visible in the rock art of the Saharan pastoral peoples and the ceremonial objects of the predynastic sequence represent a visual tradition that was sophisticated enough to make the leap to writing relatively quickly when the administrative needs of the emerging state made such a leap advantageous. This is speculative, but it is speculative in a direction that the evidence permits, and it connects the otherwise disconnected elements of the story into a more coherent whole. There is one more ancient Egyptian mystery that belongs in this story, one that connects the deep prehistory of the Nile Valley to the moment of dynastic emergence in a way that still has not been satisfactorily explained. The Abydos boats. In 1991, a team of archaeologists excavating at the site of Abydos in Upper Egypt, the royal cemetery of the earliest pharaohs, discovered something no one expected. Buried in the desert near the formal tombs, sealed beneath the sand for 5,000 years, was a fleet of 14 wooden boats. The boats were large. The largest was approximately 18 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. They were constructed from planks of Lebanese cedar, a wood that does not grow in Egypt and must have been imported from the forests of what is now Lebanon, hundreds of kilometers away. They were buried intact, carefully wrapped in reed matting, sealed in mud brick chambers built specifically for them. The boats date to approximately 3000 to 2900 BC, making them among the oldest intact wooden boats ever discovered. But their significance goes beyond their age. The act of burying complete functional boats near a royal tomb is an act of profound ritual intention. These boats were not old and worn out, discarded after use. They were new, or nearly new, interred deliberately as part of the burial ritual of the earliest pharaohs. In dynastic Egyptian religion, the boat is one of the most important and persistent sacred objects. The solar bark, the boat in which the sun god Ra travels through the 12 hours of the night, is depicted in countless tomb paintings and described in the funerary texts from the earliest period. The pharaoh, after death, joins the sun god on this boat and traverses the underworld. The specific boats buried at Abydos were almost certainly understood as the vehicles that would carry the earliest pharaohs on this journey. The question is, where did this belief come from? The solar bark mythology is so central to dynastic Egyptian religion that it cannot be an innovation of the dynastic period. It must have roots that extend back before the pharaohs, and indeed, the boats of Hierakonpolis, depicted on the painted tomb walls of the pre-dynastic period, suggest that the boat had symbolic and ritual significance at least 1,000 years before the Abydos fleet was buried. And the Nile itself, the river that defines Egypt, is the most natural origin for a mythology centered on boats. People who lived their entire lives on or near the Nile, whose food and transport and trade all depended on the river, would naturally develop a symbolic vocabulary in which the boat occupied a central place. The movement of the sun across the sky, which from the Nile Valley appears as a great arc from east to west, the same arc traced by a boat moving along the river, would naturally suggest a metaphor of the sun as a boat travelling across the sky and beneath the earth. This is not a sophisticated or specialised connection. It is the kind of metaphor that any reflective person living beside a great river and watching the sun move across the sky might develop. What is remarkable is not that the metaphor was developed, but that it was elaborated into one of the most complex and enduring mythological systems in human history, a system that shaped the beliefs and practices of one of the most powerful civilizations the world has ever known. The roots of that system are in the predynastic period, in Hierakonpolis, in the Sahara, at Nabta Playa, at Göbekli Tepe. In the long, poorly understood, fragmentarily documented story of what human beings were thinking and building and believing in the millennia before the first pharaoh appeared at the head of a unified kingdom and changed the world, let us talk about bones. In 2017, a team of researchers from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History published a paper in Nature Communications that caused considerable discussion among Egyptologists and anthropologists. The team had managed to extract and sequence ancient DNA from 90 mummified human remains from the archaeological site of Abu Sir el-Melek in Middle Egypt. The mummies dated from approximately 1300 BC to the 4th century AD, spanning a period from the New Kingdom through the Roman occupation of Egypt. They were a window into the genetics of ancient Egyptians during the historical period that most people have in mind when they imagine ancient Egypt. The results were surprising. The ancient Egyptians whose DNA was successfully sequenced were most closely related not to modern Egyptians, who show substantial genetic affinity with populations from sub-Saharan Africa, but to ancient populations from the Levant, from Anatolia, from the ancient Near East. They were genetically more similar to people living in what is now Israel and Palestine and Lebanon and Turkey than to people living in sub-Saharan Africa. This finding has been interpreted, debated and nuanced extensively since the paper was published. It does not mean that ancient Egyptians were not African. It means that the genetics of ancient Egyptian populations, particularly during the historical period covered by the study, reflect a complex history of migration, mixing, and cultural exchange with populations to the north and northeast. The ancient Egyptians were themselves a product of population mixing, as almost every human population is. But the finding has a specific relevance to the question of Egyptian origins. It supports the model in which the development of Egyptian civilization was significantly influenced by populations coming from outside the Nile Valley, from the Near East and from Anatolia, the same regions where the Neolithic agricultural revolution began and from which agricultural practices and associated cultural traditions spread into Egypt and North Africa. And it raises a question about what the genetics of the pre-dynastic Egyptians, the people who lived in the Nile Valley during the Badarian and Naqada periods, looked like before the influence of Near Eastern populations became as strong as it appears in the historical period material. The 2017 study does not reach back that far. The ancient DNA from earlier periods has been harder to recover and sequence. But the genetic evidence that does exist for pre-dynastic populations suggests that they were more diverse than later historical populations, with a stronger genetic connection to African populations further south and west. This genetic picture is consistent with the archaeological picture. The development of Egyptian civilization was not the story of one culture developing in isolation. It was the story of multiple populations from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Sahara, from the Levant, from Anatolia, converging on the Nile Valley over the millennia of the predynastic period, bringing with them different genetic histories, different cultural traditions, different knowledge systems, and fusing all of these into something unprecedented. Egypt was not just the beginning of a civilization, it was the meeting point of many traditions, the crucible in which diverse streams of human experience and knowledge were combined and refined and distilled into a form so powerful and so durable that it shaped the subsequent history of the world for 3,000 years. Now, let us go to the heart of the mystery, the thing that makes the pre-Egyptian story not just historically interesting but philosophically significant. The oldest Egyptian religious texts, the pyramid texts, are inscribed on the walls of several pyramids from the 5th and 6th dynasties of the Old Kingdom, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara, which dates to approximately 2375 BC. They are the oldest known religious texts in the world, predating even the earliest versions of the Vedas and the Hebrew scriptures. They consist of hundreds of utterances, spells, prayers, and mythological narratives intended to assist the dead pharaoh in his journey through the afterlife. The content of the pyramid texts is complex, contradictory in places, and clearly very old. The language in which they are written is itself archaic, using forms and constructions that were already obsolete in the speech of ordinary Egyptians at the time they were inscribed. They are ancient texts, even at the time when they were first written down. The tradition they preserve is older than their inscription on pyramid walls. Within the pyramid texts, and within other early Egyptian religious texts including the coffin texts and the later Book of the Dead, there are repeated references to a specific concept, Zep Tepi, the first time, the primordial age, the period before the current order of the world was established, when the gods themselves walked the earth and the foundations of everything that followed were laid. The first time is not described in detail in any single text. It is alluded to, referenced, invoked. It is the deep background of the entire Egyptian religious worldview. Everything that the priests do, everything the pharaoh does in his ritual capacity, is understood as a reenactment of something that was first done in the first time. The rituals do not merely repeat the past, they restore it. They bring the patterns of the first time back into the present, renewing the order that was established then. What was the first time? When did it happen? The Egyptian texts are not precise about dates in the way that modern historians are precise about dates. But the astronomical content embedded in the texts, the specific references to celestial configurations and stellar positions, has been analysed by researchers including the Egyptologist Jane Sellers and the author Robert Bauval, who have proposed that some of the texts encode astronomical configurations that existed approximately 10,500 to 12,000 years ago. This is precisely the period of Göbekli Tepe, of the end of the Younger Dryas, of the beginning of the post-glacial world, of the period we have been exploring throughout this story, are the Egyptian references to the first time, to the age of the gods, memories of a real period in human prehistory, a period of cultural and intellectual sophistication that was destroyed or disrupted by the Younger Dryas catastrophe and its aftermath, and whose memory was preserved in fragmentary and increasingly mythologized form through the long millennia of the predynastic period until it was finally codified in writing in the pyramid texts. This is not a mainstream archaeological or Egyptological position. It is speculative in ways that go beyond what the available evidence strictly supports. The astronomical dating of mythological texts is a contested methodology. The connection between Zep Tepi and a specific prehistoric period is not established science in the way that the radiocarbon dates of Göbekli Tepe are established science. But the concept is not ridiculous. Oral traditions can preserve cultural memories for extraordinary lengths of time. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that describe the flooding of coastal landscapes are now understood to encode memories of events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago, transmitted through an unbroken chain of cultural transmission across hundreds of generations. The flood myths we have discussed in previous explorations show similar patterns of preservation across vast timescales. If oral traditions in other parts of the world can preserve memories of events from the end of the last ice age, it is not inherently implausible that the Egyptian concept of the first time preserves something similar. What we can say with more confidence is that the Egyptian religious tradition, as expressed in the pyramid texts and related documents, describes a worldview that feels very old, that has the texture of something that was already ancient when it was first written down. That reflects a way of understanding the relationship between the human world and the cosmic order that goes beyond what any single civilization could have developed in the roughly 500 years between the emergence of the proto-state in the Naqada period and the construction of the pyramids. Egypt is old, but the ideas that built Egypt may be older still. There is a structure at Abydos that is worth discussing at some length. Not the royal tombs of the early dynastic period, not the great temple complex of Seti I, beautiful as it is, a structure that sits behind and below the Seti temple, accessed through an opening in the temple's rear wall, that has generated more controversy and more genuine scholarly puzzlement than almost anything else in Egyptian archaeology, the Osirian. The Osirian is a structure associated with the cult of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, who is one of the most important figures in the Egyptian religious tradition. It was built, in its current form, during the reign of Seti I in the New Kingdom, approximately 1200 BC. At least, that is the conventional dating based on the inscriptions found within it. But the Osirian does not look like New Kingdom architecture. New Kingdom Egyptian architecture is distinctive. It is large, yes, but its largeness is achieved through walls of relatively modest stone blocks stacked in courses, carefully fitted but not dramatically massive. It is covered in inscriptions and painted decoration. It uses columns in specific styles characteristic of the period. It is beautiful and imposing, but it is architecturally comprehensible. The Osirian is different in kind. The central hall of the Osirian consists of massive granite monoliths, some of them weighing over 100 tons, fitted together without mortar, in a style that is megalithic rather than architectural in the conventional sense. The structure is partially subterranean, its floor below the level of the surrounding ground, accessible by passages that descend into it from above. In the centre is an island surrounded by a channel of water fed by the water table, creating a symbolic representation of the primordial mound of creation rising from the primordial ocean. The style of construction and the symbolic program are archaic in a way that does not fit comfortably with the New Kingdom context. The Egyptologist Henri Frankfort, who excavated the Osirian in the 1920s and 1930s, noted that the architectural style was unlike anything else in New Kingdom Egypt. He observed that the massive granite construction had more in common with the Valley Temple of Khafre at Giza, itself a structure of contested date, than with anything from the period of Seti I. Frankfurt speculated that the Osirian might preserve the design, or even the actual remains, of a much older structure that Seti I had restored or rebuilt over. This speculation has not been confirmed. The evidence for a much older original beneath the current Osirian is suggestive but not definitive. The Egyptological mainstream treats the Osirian as a New Kingdom construction that deliberately used an archaic style to evoke great antiquity, a common practice in Egyptian architecture. But the question remains, why would Seti I choose to build a structure in an archaic megalithic style, using construction techniques completely at odds with those used in every other New Kingdom monument, if that archaic style did not carry some specific significance? The Egyptians were fully capable of building in their contemporary style, as every other New Kingdom monument demonstrates. The use of a radically different, older-looking style was a deliberate choice. It communicated something. What it communicated was probably something about the age and the authenticity of the tradition the Osirian was meant to represent. The cult of Osiris claimed antiquity beyond all other cults. It was the oldest of the old, the foundation of everything, the first story of death and resurrection, from which all subsequent spiritual life derived. Building the most important shrine to Osiris in a style that looked older than everything else was, in this reading, a statement about the depth of the tradition the shrine embodied. And if the tradition was genuinely that old, if the Osirian mythology really did have roots extending back into the predynastic period and beyond, into the long millennia before writing and before cities and before the pharaohs, then the archaic style of the Osirian might preserve a genuine memory of something real, a memory of the kind of building that was associated with these ideas when the ideas were first developing. It is impossible to prove this, but it is also impossible to prove it wrong, and the ambiguity, the unresolved question that hangs over the Osirian, is itself part of the larger story of before Egypt, a story full of suggestive traces and missing evidence and questions that the conventional historical narrative has not fully accommodated. Let us think now about the specific human experience of all of this, about what it would have been like to live in the centuries and millennia before the pharaohs, in the world that was slowly, without anyone planning it, without anyone knowing what it would eventually become, developing into Egypt. You're living approximately 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, in the late Badarian period. Your community is on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, on a low rise above the floodplain. The annual flood, the inundation, comes every year at the same time, depositing the dark, fertile silt that makes the riverbanks productive. Your people have been managing their relationship with the flood, planting as the waters recede and harvesting before they return, for generations before you were born. The knowledge you carry, the specific understanding of when to plant and when to harvest, which soils are most productive and which flood-prone, which wild plants can supplement the agricultural harvest in lean years, which animals can be hunted in the hills to the west, and which wading birds can be taken in the reed beds by the river, is an inherited body of knowledge built up over longer than anyone can remember. It did not spring into existence in your generation. It came from your parents and their parents and everyone who lived before them in this place, and in places like it along the great river. Your world extends some distance up and down the river and a shorter distance into the desert on either side. But it is not a closed world. Boats travel the river, traders bring goods from upstream and downstream, objects made of stone not found in your region appear at the market. Information about events further away arrives slowly and imperfectly, but it does arrive. Your world is connected. The beliefs you hold about the nature of the world, about what happens after death, about the relationship between the human world and the powers that govern the cycle of flood and drought, and the movement of the sun and stars, are not yours individually. They are the beliefs of your community, transmitted in stories and rituals and in the specific ways things are done. When someone dies, the body is oriented in a specific direction, placed in a specific position, buried with specific objects, not because your generation invented these practices, because this is how it has always been done, back to before living memory. You know that there are places upstream where people build large structures out of stone. You've heard about them, perhaps seen them if you've travelled that far. Göbekli Tepe is too distant and too old to be in your direct experience, but the tradition of building things for reasons that go beyond practical necessity is familiar. Your community has its own gathering places, its own sacred spots, its own locations where certain things are done at certain times of year because that is where and when they belong. The year is organized for you by the flood and by the stars. The rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, just before dawn in late summer, marks the beginning of the flood season. You know this not because you calculated it, but because it was told to you. It was told to the person who told you, and to the person before that, in an unbroken chain of observation and transmission going back further than your tradition has a way to count. This is a sophisticated body of knowledge, not sophisticated in the way that modern science is sophisticated, but sophisticated in the sense of being accumulated, tested, refined and preserved over long periods. The people around you are not primitive, they are adapted, exquisitely adapted to their specific environment, in possession of an intricate practical understanding of the Nile ecosystem that modern ecologists would recognize as genuinely impressive. And something is changing, something in the way communities are organized, something in the scale of the projects that are being undertaken, in the number of people involved in coordinated activities, in the degree of specialization of different individuals' roles. The world is getting more complex, not because anyone planned it, because the population is growing. The agricultural base is more reliable than it was in your grandparents' time, and more reliable food means more people, and more people means more social complexity, and more social complexity means new possibilities. The person in your community who knows the most about the stars and their relationship to the flood is honoured in a way that a person with ordinary knowledge is not. The person who controls the access to the best agricultural land has power that translates into other kinds of power. The person who can negotiate trade agreements with the communities upstream and downstream is valuable in a way that creates social leverage. Hierarchy is developing, not rapidly, not dramatically, but inexorably. And the beliefs, the stories of the first time, the accounts of how things came to be the way they are and what obligations the current generation has to the patterns established then, are becoming more elaborate, more organized, more specifically formulated. The priesthood that will eventually become the formal priesthood of dynastic Egypt is not yet a formal institution, but the specialization that will produce it is already present. The people whose specific role is to maintain the relationship with the sacred are already distinct from the people whose role is to grow the food and build the boats and trade the goods. This world, 5,000 years before Christ, is not Egypt, but it is becoming Egypt. Everything that will eventually crystallize into the pharaonic state is present here in embryonic form. The agricultural base, the Nile-centered cosmology, the stellar calendar, the emerging hierarchy, the accumulation of ritual knowledge in the hands of specialists, the trade networks, the boats, all of it present, none of it yet organized into the form we recognize. And further back, in the Sahara that is slowly drying, in the places where the cattle people are beginning to understand that the world they were born into is ending, and that they will have to go somewhere else, the same elements are present in different forms. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the stones of Nabta Playa, the cattle rituals with their implications about the sacred nature of the cow, the knowledge of the stars and their relationship to the seasons and the rains, all of it about to be carried to the Nile by people who have nowhere else to go. The conventional history of ancient Egypt begins with Narmer, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, with the double crown, with the administrative machinery of the pharaonic state, with the art and writing and monumental architecture that make Egypt immediately recognizable across 5,000 years of time. But the before is part of the story too. The long, obscure, fragmentarily documented millennia during which the elements of Egyptian civilization were assembling themselves from multiple sources and in multiple locations, drawing on traditions that stretched back not just to the earliest agricultural communities of the Nile Valley, but to the green Sahara, to the pastoral cultures of the lake basins and the river valleys that are now sand, to the astronomical monuments built by people whose names we will never know, to the ritual traditions preserved in the oldest religious texts in a form already ancient when they were first written down. The civilization that built the pyramids was not self-invented. Nothing human ever is. It drew on everything that came before it, synthesized it, amplified it, expressed it in a form so powerful and so specifically Egyptian that we tend to see it as springing fully formed from the desert. But it did not spring from the desert. It grew from the Nile, and from the Sahara, and from the Near East, and from the minds of people who'd been thinking about the stars and the gods and the relationship between the human world and the cosmic order for much longer than any monument we can visit would suggest. What is the civilization that should not exist? Not Egypt itself. Egypt exists, abundantly and beautifully. What should not exist according to the conventional model is the depth of tradition behind Egypt, the astronomical sophistication of Nabta Playa, the social complexity of Göbekli Tepe, the cattle rituals that prefigure Hathor, the boats that prefigure the solar bark, the oral traditions that become Zep Tepi. These things should not exist at the time they existed. They are too complex, too sophisticated, too organized for the standard model of how cultures develop. And yet they are there, in the ground, in the stones, in the oldest texts, waiting to be understood not as anomalies but as chapters in a story that the conventional narrative has not yet fully told. That story is being written now in archaeological excavations and genetic studies and astronomical analyses by researchers who are slowly piecing together a picture of the deep human past that is more complex and more interesting than the textbooks have suggested. Göbekli Tepe was found in 1994, Nabta Playa was found in the 1970s. The genetic study of ancient Egyptian mummies was published in 2017. The best is probably still to come. The answer to the question of what came before Egypt is not a clean, single answer. It is a long, tangled, partially obscured, deeply human story of populations moving and mixing and building and remembering and forgetting and rebuilding across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, driven by the same impulses that drive us. The need to understand the world, the need to mark the passage of time, the need to honor the dead, the need to build something that will last longer than a single life. Those impulses are not new. They are not products of civilization. They are the ingredients of civilization. They are what drove the hunter-gatherers of Göbekli Tepe to move 20-ton stones to a hilltop for purposes that went beyond any practical necessity. What drove the pastoralists of Nabta Playa to arrange standing stones in alignment with the summer solstice sunrise? What drove the predynastic elites of Hierakonpolis to build painted tombs and ceremonial precincts? What eventually drove the pharaohs to build the pyramids? The same impulse, the same humanity, separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, but connected by the deep continuity of human nature. Egypt did not begin with Nama. It began when the first person looked at the stars and decided they meant something. When the first funeral included objects placed alongside the dead because the living believed the dead would need them. When the first monument was built not because it was useful but because it was important. When exactly that happened, we do not know. But it was a very, very long time before the double crown was placed on the first pharaoh's head. There is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves serious attention, even though it is one of the most contested topics in all of Egyptology. A topic where the mainstream scholarly consensus is clear, but where the dissenting evidence is real enough and specific enough that dismissing it entirely would be intellectually dishonest. The age of the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza is the largest monolithic statue in the world. Its body is approximately 73 meters long and 20 meters high. It faces east. It was carved according to the conventional Egyptological consensus during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, approximately 4,500 years ago. The evidence for this dating is primarily circumstantial. The Sphinx is located in the same complex as Khafre's pyramid and his valley temple, and a damaged stele found between the Sphinx's paws appears to mention Khafre in a context that some scholars interpret as commemorating his construction of the monument. In 1992, a geologist named Robert Schott, a professor at Boston University who specializes in the geological analysis of rock surfaces, published an analysis of the weathering patterns visible on the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the pit carved into the limestone plateau around the body of the statue. His conclusion was startling to the Egyptological community. The weathering on the Sphinx body and enclosure is not wind and sand erosion, which is the expected pattern for a monument in the Egyptian desert. It is precipitation erosion. The pattern of deep, rounded, vertical channels cut into the rock is the signature of water running down a vertical surface over long periods. The problem is that the kind of sustained heavy rainfall required to produce the weathering shock observed in the Sphinx enclosure did not fall on the Giza Plateau after approximately 5000 BC. Before that date, during the African humid period we have been discussing, the rainfall was sufficient, which means, if Schock's analysis is correct, that the Sphinx was carved and exposed to rainfall at a date considerably earlier than the conventional dating, not 4,500 years ago, somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BC at the earliest estimate, and possibly earlier. The Egyptological response to Schoch's work has been largely dismissive. Critics have argued that the weathering pattern can be explained by wind erosion, by flash flooding, by the differential hardness of different limestone layers, by various mechanisms that do not require the Sphinx to be as old as Schoch proposes. Schoch has responded to each of these objections in detail, maintaining that the precipitation erosion interpretation is the most geologically coherent. The debate is genuinely technical and has not been definitively resolved. What cannot be denied is that Schoch is a credentialed geologist at a serious institution, making a specific technical argument based on direct observation of rock surfaces. The argument may be wrong, but it is not frivolous. If the Sphinx is as old as Schoch's analysis suggests, it would be the oldest known large monumental structure on Earth, predating Göbekli Tepe in its current form and contemporary with the Green Sahara, with the pastoral cultures of Nabta Playa, with the world that preceded the agricultural revolution. It would represent a level of social organization and artistic ambition in northeastern Africa that is genuinely extraordinary for that period. It would also fit the broader pattern we've been tracing through this story, a pattern of sophisticated human activity in the Nile Valley and its surrounding region going back much further than the conventional historical narrative acknowledges. A pattern that includes Nabta Playa and the cattle burials and the astronomical alignments, and that connects the pastoral cultures of the Green Sahara to the civilization that eventually built the pyramids. The conventional dating of the Sphinx may be correct. The Sphinx may indeed be 4,500 years old, built by Khafre, and the weathering may have a conventional geological explanation that does not require great age. The evidence for the conventional dating is real and it deserves respect. But the question is not definitively closed, and in the context of everything else we've been discussing, the possibility that the Sphinx is much older than conventionally dated is not as implausible as it might seem in isolation. It is consistent with the emerging picture of a deep human tradition in the Nile Valley region that stretches back to the Green Sahara and the period of Göbekli Tepe. There is also a specific ancient text that is directly relevant here. The inventory stele, found at Giza in the 19th century and now in the Cairo Museum, dates in its current form to the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. The stele describes Khufu finding the Sphinx already existing, already ancient on the Giza Plateau, and performing restoration work on it. If the inventory stele accurately describes Khufu's activities, it would mean the Sphinx predates the pyramids by at least enough time to be considered ancient in Khufu's era. Egyptologists generally regard the inventory stele as a later text composed in the image of the Old Kingdom rather than an actual Old Kingdom document. The arguments for this interpretation are technical and relate to the language and content of the text, but the debate about the inventory stele, like the debate about the Sphinx weathering, reflects the genuine uncertainties that surround the question of Egyptian origins. What we can say with confidence is this: the Giza Plateau, which to the modern world represents the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian achievement, was a sacred space before the pyramids were built. The evidence for ritual activity at Giza predating the Old Kingdom is present. The specific orientation of the Sphinx, facing east toward the rising sun, suggests a solar religious tradition that connects to the predynastic solar theology, developing along the Nile and in the Sahara, long before the pharaonic period. The pyramids are the most famous things at Giza, but they were not built on an empty plateau. They are built in a place that was already sacred. The sacredness came first, the monuments followed, and the sacredness came from somewhere. From the long tradition of astronomical observation and solar worship and ritual activity that we've been tracing through this entire story. From the before that preceded Egypt, from the first time, there's also the matter of the Dendera zodiac. This extraordinary carved ceiling from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, depicts the complete Egyptian celestial map, showing the sky and its constellations and the positions of the planets at a specific astronomical moment. The ceiling in its current form was carved during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus, approximately 50 BC, but the astronomical configuration it depicts, the specific positions of the planets relative to the constellations, corresponds not to the 1st century BC but to a much earlier period. Various analyses have been made of the Dendera zodiac's astronomical content. Some researchers have proposed that the configuration depicted corresponds to a date around 4000 BC, during the Naqada period of the Egyptian predynastic. Others have proposed even earlier dates. The precise astronomical reading depends on interpretive choices about which features of the ceiling represent which celestial bodies, choices that are not always unambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that the Dendera zodiac is a document of genuine astronomical knowledge. The Egyptians who commissioned and created it understood the positions of the planets and their relationship to the stellar background with sufficient precision to encode a specific astronomical moment in stone. The astronomical tradition that produced this knowledge did not begin in the 1st century BC. It had roots stretching back through the entire dynastic period and beyond, into the pre-dynastic astronomical traditions we have been discussing. The consistent thread through all of this is the relationship between the Egyptian religious tradition and the sky, the solar boat of Ra, the stellar alignments of temples, the orientation of the pyramids and the Sphinx, the astronomical encoding of the Dendera zodiac, the cattle goddess Hathor identified with the night sky, the first time located in a specific stellar configuration. Ancient Egypt was, among many other things, an astronomical civilization. Its religious life was organized around the movement of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars in ways that required sustained, careful observation over long periods and the transmission of that observational knowledge across generations. The astronomical tradition of dynastic Egypt did not begin with the first dynasty. It was inherited from the predynastic period, and the predynastic period inherited it from whatever came before. What came before included Nabta Playa, included the summer solstice alignments of the stone circles in the dried lake bed, included the stellar knowledge encoded in the arrangement of specific upright stones, included the long tradition of watching the sky from the pastoral camps of the Green Sahara and understanding what the stars meant for the seasons and the rains and the movements of the herds. The sky was the same sky then that it is now. The stars that the people of Nabta Playa watched are the stars we watch tonight, shifted slightly in their positions by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, but recognizably the same. The constellations they named, if they named them, may be the constellations we inherited from the Greeks, who may have inherited them from the Egyptians, who may have inherited them from the people of the Green Sahara. The astronomical tradition is the longest continuous thread in the human story, older than writing, older than agriculture, older than anything we call civilization, It begins when the first human being looked up at the night sky and noticed that the stars moved in patterns, that the same patterns returned at the same times of year, that the patterns could be used to orient oneself in time and space, that understanding them was useful and important, and worth the effort of careful observation and precise transmission. That moment, whenever it happened, was the beginning of something that is still ongoing, the beginning of the human project of understanding the cosmos and our place within it, the beginning that eventually produced Nabta Playa and Göbekli Tepe and the astronomical traditions of dynastic Egypt and the Dendera zodiac and the modern science of astronomy. Egypt did not begin that tradition. It inherited it, amplified it, expressed it in spectacular form, and transmitted it forward to the cultures that came after. The before is in us too, in every calculation of when the sun will rise, and in every building oriented to the cardinal directions, and in every calendar we consult to know what time of year it is. The first time is still happening. It never stopped. Now let me bring these threads together honestly. What do we know, and what do we not know? And what does the combination of knowledge and ignorance tell us about the civilization that should not exist? We know that Göbekli Tepe exists, that it was built by hunter-gatherers approximately 11,500 years ago, that it represents a level of social organization and symbolic sophistication that the standard model of cultural development did not predict for that time period. The evidence is solid, the dating is reliable, the fact of the structure is not in question. We know that Nabta Playa exists, that it contains megalithic structures and cattle burials and astronomical alignments that date to approximately 7,000 to 5,000 BC, that it represents sophisticated ritual and astronomical activity by the pastoral people of the Green Sahara long before the dynastic Egyptian state emerged in the Nile Valley. We know that the predynastic period in Egypt is longer and more complex than the conventional emphasis on dynastic Egypt suggests, that Hierakonpolis was a proto-urban centre with evidence of complex social organization from approximately 3,800 BC, that the Badarian culture produced pottery of extraordinary technical sophistication as early as 5,000 BC, that the genetic evidence suggests Egyptian civilization drew on multiple population streams including Near Eastern, Saharan and African sources. We know that the earliest dynastic Egyptian writing appears complex and sophisticated, without a clear developmental record of simpler precursors, that the Egyptian religious tradition, as expressed in the pyramid texts, describes a first time that feels ancient even by the standards of 5,000 years ago, that structures like the Osirion at Abydos use an architectural vocabulary that seems older than their conventional dating. What we do not know is how all of these things connect, whether the astronomical tradition of Nabta Playa is a direct precursor of the dynastic Egyptian stellar cult or a parallel development, whether the concept of Zep Tepi preserves genuine cultural memories of the period before the pharaohs or is a theological construct invented to claim authority for existing institutions, whether the complexity of Göbekli Tepe represents a genuinely sophisticated prehistoric culture with connections to later Egyptian civilization or an isolated and exceptional phenomenon with limited broader implications. The honest answer is that we are still in the middle of this investigation. The tools of ancient DNA analysis, of high-resolution dating, of systematic survey archaeology are being applied to the questions we've been discussing and producing new evidence at a rate that would have been impossible 20 years ago. The picture is getting clearer, but it is not yet clear. What is already clear is that the standard narrative, the one that places the beginning of meaningful human civilization at the moment the first pharaoh put on the double crown, is insufficient. There was a before, a long, complex, richly populated before, full of people who thought deeply and built ambitiously and organized their societies with sophistication and looked at the stars with understanding. The civilization that emerged in Egypt was not created from nothing. It was assembled over millennia from the raw materials of a long human tradition. Understanding that tradition, recovering it from the fragments that remain in the ground and in the oldest texts, is one of the most important and one of the most exciting intellectual projects of our time. Every excavation at new site in the Eastern Sahara adds a piece. Every ancient DNA study from a predynastic Egyptian specimen adds a piece. Every careful analysis of the astronomical content of the pyramid texts adds a piece. The puzzle is not complete. It may never be complete. The evidence that would fill the largest gaps is probably buried under the Saharan sand or lost to the erosion of 10,000 years. But the pieces we do have, the ones we have been discussing tonight, form a picture that is already remarkable. The civilization that should not exist, the tradition of sophisticated human activity that preceded and eventually became Egypt, was real. It was built by real people, with real knowledge and real beliefs and real aspirations. Their names are mostly lost. Their languages are mostly unknown. Their stories survive, if they survive at all, only in the most fragmentary and transformed form in the oldest Egyptian religious texts. But their monuments are still there, at Göbekli Tepe, at Nabta Playa, at Hierakonpolis, in the grain of the granite, blocks of the Osirian, in the painted images on the walls of the earliest Egyptian tombs, in the stones arranged in alignment with the summer solstice sunrise on a lake bed that is now desert, in the positions of the stars that haven't changed since the first person watched them rise and decided they meant something. The before is still there, waiting for the questions that will let it speak. Let the desert settle around you gently tonight. The questions we've been sitting with are too old and too large to resolve in a single evening. They've been accumulating for 10,000 years. They can wait a little longer. Think about the shepherd who walked across Göbekli Tepe every day without knowing what was under his feet. About the archaeologists who have spent decades carefully removing the soil that covered it, stone by stone, year by year, and who have still uncovered only a fraction of what is there. The geophysical surveys of the site suggest that more than 90% of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated. 9/10 of the oldest monumental complex ever built is still in the ground, still waiting. Think about the Saharan lake beds where Nabta Playa sits, and the hundreds of other sites that have been identified by survey and not yet excavated, each one potentially holding pieces of the picture we're trying to reconstruct. Think about the ancient DNA locked in pre-dynastic Egyptian bones in museums and storage facilities, not yet sequenced, potentially carrying genetic information that would transform the understanding of Egyptian origins. Think about the oldest Egyptian texts, the pyramid texts, and the generations of scholars who have spent their lives studying them, and the fact that there is still genuine disagreement about what some of them mean, what tradition they encode, what period of human experience they ultimately reflect. The investigation is ongoing. The story is not finished. The civilization that should not exist is slowly, piece by piece, coming into focus. And somewhere in that story, in the deep before that preceded the pharaohs, are people who looked up at the same stars you are lying under tonight and found in them meaning, found in them orientation, found in them the assurance that the world had an order, that the order could be understood, that understanding it was one of the most important things a human being could do. They were right about that. The order is there. The stars move in the patterns they always have. The Nile still floods. The sun still rises. The things that were true in the first time are still true now. Rest in that. The first time is very far away, but the things it set in motion are still unfolding. If you are listening to this tonight and finding it worth your time, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It takes a moment and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of deep, carefully researched content. Leave a comment too, telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. These stories feel different at different hours. Now let us keep going. There is a site in Egypt that is less famous than Giza, but in some ways more instructive for understanding the deep roots of Egyptian civilization. The site is called Hierakonpolis, which we have visited already, but there is a specific find from Hierakonpolis that deserves its own extended discussion. A painted tomb. Tomb 100 at Hierakonpolis is the oldest known painted tomb in Egypt. It dates to approximately 3500 BC, making it roughly 400 years older than the Narmer palette and approximately 500 years before the establishment of the dynastic state. The paintings on its walls are extraordinary. They show boats, large boats with many rowers, in scenes that include human figures, animals, and what appear to be ritual or narrative events. The boats are depicted in a style that is distinct from classical Egyptian art but recognizably related to it. The human figures shown in association with the boats include some who appear to be in positions of dominance or authority, some who appear to be engaged in combat or ritual killing, and some who are simply present as participants in a scene whose full meaning we cannot reconstruct. The imagery is complex enough to tell us that the people who commissioned and created it had a sophisticated visual vocabulary and a specific narrative or ritual tradition they were using that vocabulary to express. The boats of Hierakonpolis, like the boats that will eventually be buried at Abydos, like the boats of the solar mythology that will eventually be inscribed on pyramid walls, are not just boats. They are symbolic objects. They carry meaning that goes beyond their practical function as vehicles for moving along the Nile. The specific details of the paintings at Tomb 100 suggest that the boat had already, by 3500 BC, acquired the kind of sacred or ritual significance that it will carry throughout the entire dynastic period. Where did that significance come from? What does it mean that the boat was sacred before the pharaohs were sacred? That the visual vocabulary of what will become Egyptian royal iconography was already present in its essential outlines at least 500 years before the first historical pharaoh? The answer, or at least the beginning of an answer, is that the social and ritual complex we call Egyptian civilization was not invented by Narmer. It was inherited by him. The boats, the hieratic scale, the specific poses of dominance and submission, the symbolic vocabulary of animals and gods and human authority, all of these were already present in the material culture of the predynastic period. Narmer did not create Egyptian civilization. He consolidated it, unified it politically under a single administrative structure, and gave it the specific pharaonic form that we recognize. But the civilization itself was already there. and if it was already there at 3500 BC, it was developing before that. And if it was developing before that, the roots go back into the Badarian period. And if the Badarian period is influenced by the movements of population from the drying Sahara, then the roots go back into the Green Sahara. And if the Green Sahara has astronomical monuments and cattle rituals and visual traditions that connect to later Egyptian religion, then the roots go back to 7,000 years before Christ, to Nabta Playa, and from Nabta Playa back to the end of the Younger Dryas, to the period when the Green Sahara was first becoming possible, to the time when Göbekli Tepe was being built. The thread is continuous. It is not always visible, and where it is visible it is often frayed and fragmentary, but it is there. The civilization that built the pyramids was the latest and most spectacular expression of a tradition that had been developing through many forms and many populations for thousands of years. That is the true depth of Egypt, not 3100 BC, not 5000 BC, not even 7000 BC. The tradition of which Egypt is the most famous expression goes back to the end of the last ice age, to the extraordinary and still incompletely understood flowering of human cultural complexity that accompanied the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. Let us also spend some time with one of the most specific and most durable mysteries in Egyptology: the question of where the ancient Egyptians believed their knowledge came from. Throughout the dynastic period, and most explicitly in the texts of the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, but clearly rooted in much older traditions, the ancient Egyptians maintained that the foundations of their civilization, writing, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, religious ritual, had been given to them by the gods, specifically by a figure called Thoth, who is depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, who carries a writing palette and is associated with wisdom, writing, magic, and the measurement of time. Thoth did not invent these things, he transmitted them. They were already there, in the records of the first time, and Thoth's role was to pass them forward from that primordial period to the human civilization that followed it. In some versions of the tradition, Thoth was himself a recorder of the events of the first time, a divine historian who preserved the knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The idea that the foundation of civilization was received from an earlier source rather than invented from scratch is not unique to Egypt. Similar traditions appear in Mesopotamia, where the culture hero Oannes is described as having emerged from the sea in the distant past to teach humanity the arts of civilization. It appears in India, where the Vedic tradition attributes sacred knowledge to divine revelation in a timeless past. It appears in many other cultures in forms that are specific to their own traditions, but share the essential structure of knowledge descending from a transcendent source. These traditions have been interpreted in many ways. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats them as mythological explanations for the origins of cultural practices whose actual historical origins were unknown even to the people who performed them. The practice of writing, for example, was old enough by the time it was first codified in Egyptian religious texts that its actual human inventors were beyond historical memory. In the absence of historical knowledge, mythological attribution to divine origin is the natural human response. This is probably the correct interpretation. Cultural practices that are very old tend to get attributed to divine or supernatural origin because their human origins are genuinely unknown. The divine origin story is not a lie. It is a way of acknowledging that the knowledge is older than any living human, older than any remembered tradition, older than the horizon of historical memory. But the direction of the attribution is interesting. The ancient Egyptians did not claim that Thoth invented writing in the distant past. They claimed that writing had always existed in the first time and that Thoth had preserved and transmitted it. The eternal quality of the knowledge, its pre-human origin in a primordial age, is more important to the tradition than any specific moment of invention. This is a very different claim from the claim that Nama invented the pharaonic state, or that some specific historical king developed some specific administrative practice. It is a claim about the depth of a tradition so great that no human being and no human generation can take credit for originating it. It is a tradition that precedes human civilization, as the Egyptians understood it. That belongs to the first time, before the current order of the world was established. What that tradition actually was, who actually developed the astronomical knowledge and the symbolic vocabulary and the ritual practice that the dynastic Egyptians inherited, is the question we've been trying to answer throughout this story. The answer is not Thoth, but it is something, some accumulation of human knowledge and experience across the long pre-dynastic and pre-agricultural and pre-Holocene past of our species. Some tradition, or multiple traditions that developed and was preserved and eventually contributed to the astonishing cultural synthesis we call ancient Egypt. We do not have Thoth's records. We do not have the complete archive of the first time, but we have Göbekli Tepe, we have Nabta Playa, we have the Badarian pottery and the Hierakonpolis tombs and the Abydos boats and the pyramid texts and the genetic evidence and the ancient DNA studies and the ongoing excavations and the new questions they are generating. We have the fragments, and the fragments, read carefully and honestly, tell a story that is extraordinary enough, even without the parts that are missing. Here is something specific to think about, something that brings the abstract discussion of predynastic complexity down to a level that is immediately human and immediately legible. The oldest brewery in the world is in Egypt, not the oldest evidence for fermentation, not the oldest storage vessel that might have contained beer. The oldest production-scale brewery, a facility clearly designed and used for producing large quantities of beer for consumption by a population, is at Hierakonpolis, dating to approximately 3500 BC. The word brewery is not an exaggeration or an anachronism. The facility at Hierakonpolis consisted of a series of ceramic vats for fermenting grain, hearths for heating the fermenting mixture, and evidence of the specific process of malting, of allowing grain to sprout and then heating it to convert starches to sugars. That is the foundation of beer production in every culture that has ever made it. The scale of the operation suggests production rates in the hundreds of litres per batch. This was not household beer production. This was institutional beer production, capable of supplying quantities sufficient for large gatherings of people. What were those gatherings? The archaeological context of the brewery at Hierakonpolis is not the neighbourhood of ordinary domestic dwellings. It is the ceremonial precinct, the area of the site associated with ritual activity and elite power. The beer was not produced for ordinary everyday consumption. It was produced for the rituals that cemented and expressed and reinforced the social hierarchy of this early proto-urban community. Beer, in the ancient Near East and in ancient Egypt, was not a recreational beverage in the modern sense. It was a ritual and social substance. The communal consumption of beer at gatherings was an act of social bonding and social definition. who drank with whom, who provided the beer and who received it, were statements about social relationships and social power. The production of beer at scale, in a specifically ceremonial context, at the oldest known brewery in the world, is a statement about the social complexity of Hierakonpolis at 3500 BC. And the social complexity that this brewery both reflects and reinforces is not something that appeared suddenly at Hierakonpolis. It developed over centuries in the Badarian and Naqada I and Naqada II periods as the population of the Nile Valley grew, as the agricultural base became more reliable, as trade networks expanded, as the population displaced from the drying. Sahara added their traditions and their numbers to the communities along the river. The people who drank beer at the ceremonial precinct of Hierakonpolis were the heirs of a long social evolution. They were not inventing complex society. They were living in it, as naturally and as unconsciously as we live in ours. The complexity was inherited. The institutions were inherited. The beliefs that gave the ceremony meaning were inherited. And somewhere at the far end of that chain of inheritance, beyond the reach of any historical record but visible in the traces it left in stone and bone and the astronomical alignments of standing monuments, is the tradition that will eventually crystallize into the most spectacular and the most durable civilization the ancient world produced. That tradition is before Egypt, before the pharaohs, before the writing and the pyramids and the gods with the heads of animals. Before all of that, there were people who looked at the stars and built monuments and buried their cattle with ceremony and moved their communities when the world changed around them and carried everything they knew to the next place and the next generation. They did not know what Egypt would eventually become. How could they have known? They were just living their lives, doing what humans have always done, making sense of the world around them, marking the passage of time, honouring the dead, building things that would last, telling stories that would carry knowledge forward, even when the people who first had the knowledge were gone. They succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. The knowledge they carried transformed beyond recognition through thousands of years of transmission and elaboration and reinterpretation, became the foundation of a civilization that built structures still standing after 4,000 years. That developed a writing system that preserved its records for us to read today, that created a visual tradition so powerful and so specific that it is immediately recognizable across the entire span of its 3,000 years of existence. The civilization that should not exist was not the pharaonic state. The pharaonic state makes a certain kind of sense, given enough time and the right conditions. The civilization that should not exist is the depth of tradition behind it, the knowledge that was too old to have been developed in the time available, the sophistication that was too complete to have been assembled from scratch. But it was not assembled from scratch. It was inherited from the Green Sahara, from Göbekli Tepe, from the astronomical monuments built by people who understood the relationship between the stars and the seasons before writing existed to record that understanding. From the first time, however, we ultimately understand that concept, whether as mythology or as memory or as both. The before exists. It is real, and it is extraordinary. Tonight, as you let the story settle into something quieter, think of this. Somewhere in the desert of southern Egypt, in a dried lake bed that was once full of water and surrounded by cattle and people, and standing stones oriented to the summer solstice, the stones of Nabta Playa are still there. They have been there for 7,000 years. They have watched the Sahara dry out around them, They have watched the people who arranged them disappear, their descendants moving to the Nile Valley, their cattle culture becoming the cattle goddess of the pharaonic religion. They have watched Egypt rise and fall. They have watched the Romans and the Arabs and the modern world pass over the desert without stopping. And at Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried by the people who built it approximately 9,000 years ago, the T-shaped pillars with their carved foxes and vultures and human arms are still there, still in the ground, still waiting. The geophysical surveys say that what has been excavated is a small fraction of what exists. There is more, much more enclosures, more pillars, more carvings, more of the oldest monumental complex ever built, still under the soil of a limestone hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and in the predynastic cemeteries along the Nile, in the bone beds and storage pits and hearth debris of sites that have been partially excavated and partially understood, the genetic information of the people who built the civilization before Egypt is preserved in the material of their bodies, waiting for the analytical tools to reach them. The investigation is not finished. It has barely begun in some of the most important areas. The before is still speaking in fragments through the incomplete medium of the archaeological record about what it was and how it built what came after. The full story will not be known in our lifetimes, perhaps not in many lifetimes after ours. The scale of the mystery, the length of the timeline, the depth of the human past involved is simply too great for any generation to fully decode. But the direction of understanding is clear. The before is real. It was complex. It had depth. It had knowledge. It built things. It believed things. It carried its traditions across the catastrophes of the deep past and delivered them, transformed but continuous, to the civilization we call Egypt, and through Egypt to us. Rest now. The stars are the same stars they looked at. The Nile is the same river they depended on. The questions they asked about what comes after death and what the stars mean and how to mark the passage of time are the same questions we are still asking. The first time was a long time ago, but the questions it raised are still with us, still alive, still worth asking. Sleep well,